Hello and welcome to the Meaning Project podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel A. Franz, and as always, thank you for this opportunity to bring a little bit of mental health and meaning to your day. And boy, do we need it, or at least that's what my latest apocryphal readings are telling me. They're not truly apocalyptic. They're actually quite well researched, but they're interesting. They paint a picture that we might want to be worried about. We might want to take some action about. So I'll give you the long story how I fell into these readings recently, because it is kind of an odd story of reading so much disappointing research at one time, along, of course, with my usual, Dr. Viktor Frankl readings. But are you a fan of The Office? I remember in the early 2000s, my wife and I raising kids, we loved The Office. It was a beautiful respite from the everyday, some good comedy, some humor, certainly some cringiness every once in a while. One of the main protagonists, the manager, Michael Scott, sometimes his behavior for a young psychologist was just too much. But one of the other characters, Michael Scott's good friend Dwight Schrute, is played by a gentleman named Rainn Wilson in the real world. And Rainn's a fascinating human being. He has interesting views on politics and mental health, and not always in agreement with mine, but he's definitely well-read and well-spoken, and somebody I enjoy listening to every once in a while, even reading. And he's got a new podcast out called Soul Boom, and I figured I'd take a look at it last week and ran across, as one of his guests, one of my truly favorite authors, Mr. Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T. I don't know if it's hate or height, but Mr. Jonathan wrote one of my favorite books called The Happiness Hypothesis, where he studies not just the science, but also the mythology and the ancient cultural teachings on happiness. It's a fascinating book, very well written, and quite a joy to read. After that, let's see. So yeah, The Office, Rainn Wilson, Jonathan Haidt on the show talking about his new book. Now, in between his new book and Happiness Hypothesis, he wrote a book called The Coddling of the American Mind. I haven't read that one yet, but I've known a few people who have, who say it's pretty awesome, pretty spectacular, good research, good writing. I haven't read that one yet. What he was talking about on the podcast, though, was his new book, The Anxious Generation. And it's a much longer title. I actually had to write it down for you. It's called The Anxious Generation, How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. And I thought, well, that's right up my alley, trying to figure out what's the deal with our current mental illness? Why do we seem to have such a crisis? And he really, in the podcast, excuse me, I've only gotten the sample of the book so far and kind of skimmed through it. The podcast gives you a good survey of the writing, but he has one particularly favorite culprit in the podcast, I would assume in the book as well. What is causing this great epidemic of mental illness? Smartphones and social media. And he provides some pretty interesting evidence that there is an almost hockey stick shaped graph around the year, I think it was 2013, he said, somewhere around there, somewhere between now and the start of the millennium, when smartphones became much more ubiquitous in our lives and in our children's lives. And he shares this idea that because of the access to world tragedy, bullying, all sorts of misinformation, or just poor information, our children are struggling with mental illness, specifically, as the title says, anxiety and depression. That because they see so much of this, that they see so much diagnostic criteria. They see the diagnoses that, my goodness, I had to study that great big red book behind me, the DSM-4, just to gain access to what the criteria were to be considered depressed. Nowadays, kids can look it up at any time. And as I've said before, they can look it up and see the criteria. And then, of course, we have that tendency towards bias to match that with our feelings. Oh, yeah, that's how I feel. When many times we, especially our children, if you haven't studied psychology in the DSM-4 or the DSM-5, might not even know what some of those foundational words mean in the criteria. But yet you can read them and assume and then match them to your own feeling and self-diagnose within 30 seconds. Dr. Google and WebMD have become quite concerning tools in our population. I know in my work with young adults and teens, many of them come to me already knowing their diagnosis. And I have to ask, hey, who provided this diagnosis for you? And I'm not kidding. 75% say, well, I did the research myself. Or, and just as concerning, it's their physician sometimes, who equally is usually a highly intelligent individual, but may not have that foundational language in mental health. So Jonathan Haidt says, cell phones, smartphones, social media access, these things are causing our epidemic of mental illness in young people. And concern, this is kind of one of my big concerns. What happens in 10 or 15 or 20 years as these young people go out into the workforce? It will be interesting if we don't start to change things. So with Jonathan Haidt, I was introduced to another author this week. Excuse me. Bit of a frog in my throat. And unfortunately, once again, I don't have my good friend Dr. B to speak when I need to cough or take a sip of coffee. So from Jonathan Haidt on to Abigail Shrier. I knew nothing of Ms. Shrier. Was introduced by a new business friend and partner on the East Coast in a venture I'm looking into. And he said, for part of this project, he was reading a book called Bad Therapy: Why Kids Aren't Growing Up. And I thought, all right, well, if you're reading it, I'll take a look. And again, I think I grabbed the sample on Kindle, and I'll tell you, it made me angry. I didn't like it. I didn't like it because it was so damn accurate. Ms. Shrier talks about how children are not growing up or growing up with mental illness because of me, because of therapists, because of too much therapy at a young age focused on mood and feelings, and the idea that too much talk therapy for normal adolescent or teenage issues can cause a young person to ruminate and hyper-focus on themselves, their feelings, and any potential issue that may not even be an issue, may just be part of growing up. And so I really had to take a deep dive into this book because in some ways it was a reminder to me to check myself, to pay attention, especially when dealing with adolescents and young people, so we don't have an iatrogenic effect. Iatrogenic effect meaning that the helper does harm. And she lists several points here that were quite fascinating. The book itself, well, if you're a parent and you're considering putting your young person in therapy, if they're anywhere from 1 to 18, you might want to read this book first. It's a very good bit of research. Ms. Shrier, I will say, you might not have heard of her, or maybe you did, because she became quite controversial with her first book, Irreversible Damage, where she studied researched and spoke to quite a few people about gender surgery for young people. And the podcast I listened to with her on it, she spoke a little bit about that and how many places took her book off the market to silence her. But from the sounds of it, it sounds like a pretty well-researched book, and something, if you're interested in that, you may want to, if gender identity and pronouns and possible surgery are a question or a concern to you, I would certainly start with this book. But we're talking bad therapy. The idea that talk therapy, when done at the wrong time and possibly with the wrong therapist, somebody who may seek to overdiagnose, overpathologize a young person, causes them to ruminate on their situation and leads into a magnification of anxiety or depression. It's almost like this idea of getting on Dr. Google and seeing the symptoms and being like, oh yeah, that's me. That's my situation. Well, imagine if you're with an adult of authority, if you're a 12-year-old and you're feeling a little off, and you're with an adult of authority who says, well, yeah, you must be depressed. That's an answer and a set of, it's an identity. And we're seeing that in far too many young people today. She also talks about if if I and my people are to blame, we got to find some other people to blame too, right? So you teachers out there, she definitely points out some issues in what she calls social emotional learning. I read the book, so I went from her perspective on it. But apparently there is this style of teaching out there that really attends to, well, children's emotions a little too much. And for a personal example, I'll never forget years ago when my wife was still teaching. She came home one day and she said, well, I get to have feeling circles with my students now. And I believe she was like in kindergarten or first grade. And my first thought, in all honesty, my first thought was outrage. I thought, what? She is maybe a little qualified for that, just for being married to me and hearing me psychobabble from time to time. But most teachers are not qualified to open up the emotions of a child. With that, it's not a great idea for children to start their day with a self-assessment of mood and emotion that may impact the rest of their day. Yes, we need to teach young people how to identify and express emotions in a healthy way, but isn't that the role of the parents or the family? Shouldn't schools be for math and English? It's a hard question, but what she says, and she provides really good research in this, is that social emotional learning, focusing too much on feelings and friendship and trying to teach children what should come naturally, handicaps the most vulnerable. That was her quote. It was she provides a compelling argument here. And then, of course, therapists, teachers, who's the last one? Who is the last culprit we should hold accountable? Parents. This idea that she uses the phrase gentle parenting. I like to call it either lawnmower parenting or snowplow parent, right? We used to have helicopter parents. Now we truly have lawnmowers. Helicopter parents used to be ever present, hovering about their child. Lawnmower parents, snowplow parents, just push over obstacles for them, just run teachers and authority over so their child does not have to deal with it. And just in the way I said that, I think you can hear the problem there. If we don't allow our young people to struggle, and yes, I'm going to say it, to suffer, then they never know how to deal with it. Or as the author says, it encourages emotional turbulence. Children who never learn how to self-regulate emotion Inherently, we are born with that ability. We just have to cultivate it through relationships and friendships, through recognizing parental authority and the authority of our teachers and those around us. If we don't allow this to happen to children through free play, natural play, rather than over structuring everything they do, by allowing them to get dirty, get a little dinged up every once in a while, to engage in difficult play, sometimes even slightly on the edge of dangerous play, we handicap their ability to deal with their emotions, to form friendships, to move forward, and to grow. And when they become teenagers, they become hypersensitive to their emotions, or just unable to identify and cope with their emotions. These were two really difficult reads in the past week, or listens, or, I would highly recommend the Soul Boom episode with Jonathan Haidt on it. He's also on the Rogan show. Ms. Schreier, Abigail Schreier, and Bad Therapy, great book. You can listen to her on, I'm sure most of the time I'm starting to realize when people come out with a book, they run the podcast circuit. So check your favorite podcast for these authors. They have some very powerful messages. And here's how I sum it up. We're hurting our children. We are handicapping our children by some of the things we are doing, not just we as parents, but me and my people as therapists, as teachers. Think about it this way. Everybody that is in the world of a child in some way has the potential to be causing harm if we're doing this wrongly. And so, again, if you're a parent, I would certainly recommend reading this. Or if you work with children, if you know children, or if you care about children, these are some really powerful reads: The Anxious Generation and Bad Therapy. So what do we do about it? What's the answer? Are we going to, is this culture going to evolve with a race of, or with a group, a generation of individuals who can't self-regulate, who can't take care of themselves, who can't deal with authority, who can't cope in this world? Well, that's what the authors are saying. If we don't change course, if we don't maybe change how social media impacts them, if we don't maybe slow down on giving them technology before high school, if we continue to put kids in talk therapy too soon rather than dealing with it as a parent, we're not doing any good. And it's something to consider. So, since the title of this podcast is The Meaning Project, and we talk about logotherapy here, the good Dr. Frankel has something to say about anxiety. And the funny thing was, as I was surfing through, this is quite humorous. I was surfing through The Doctor and the Soul, and his chapters on the psychology of the concentration camp, the meaning of life, the meaning of suffering, the meaning of death. Each one of those chapters, 10, 15, 20 pages long. His chapter on, what does he call it? On the psychology of anxiety neurosis. 4 pages. 4 pages. Why is that? I don't know. Maybe if we comment on the culture back then, maybe this constant worry, this constant hyper focus on my own state and what I'm experiencing wasn't so common. Back when he wrote The Doctor and the Soul, shortly after World War II, after surviving the concentration camps of World War II, I got to feel like people just got busy getting to work, and they did things rather than sit and, as he says, navel gaze, looking at their own belly buttons, wondering, how am I feeling, right? Abigail Schreier talks to, quote some Peterson, Dr. Jordan B. Peterson, in her book. And he says, excessive self-focus is hell, right? And that's so true, but we live in a time where we encourage others, and sometimes we are encouraged to constantly focus on ourselves. And I wish I could remember where this came from in the past week, but I remember somebody saying, maybe it was in your search for meaning at the Viktor Frankl Meaning Academy. It might have been somewhere. Somebody just saying, at some point, you got to get out and do something. You got to quit sitting around and go do. It might have been one of my clients, now that I think about it, realizing that for themselves. So what does Dr. Frankl have to say about anxiety? This is a Wonderful story. I hope you don't mind me reading a couple paragraphs, right? So he starts, insofar as existential analysis of a case of anxiety neurosis interprets the neurosis as ultimately a mode of existence, a sort of spiritual attitude, the groundwork has been laid for logotherapy as a specific treatment, right? So he's saying, as long as we're secure and sure in the diagnostics that this is an issue of spiritual attitude and not biological attitude, right? Let us take an example of a case of climacteric anxiety neurosis. Climacteric. You know what that means? I had to go look it up, so don't worry. But it was important. I was like, we're just going to skip over that word and I'll kind of slur it a little bit. No, I had to look up climacteric because it means, in one sense of the word, ripening, as in the ripening of fruit. But in another way, it means menopause. So he was talking about specifically a woman in a phase of menopause in this situation who was struggling with her own anxiety, right? And that's important to the story, or else I wouldn't be focusing on it. He says, disregarding the glandular imbalance, which is a somatogenic structure of the illness, the real root of the neurosis is to be found in the existential layer. As long as we can know, so often anxiety can be glandular. It can be in our nervous system. I like to say some people are wound just a little tighter than others, right, in their nervous system. That's somatogenic. That's our body, and that's okay. When we realize that, if we know we're wound just a little tighter, we can do things about it. We can meditate. We can develop a deep breathing practice. In other ways, we need to make sure it's not, affecting our heart. Sometimes if we have heart arrhythmia or anything along those lines, POTS syndrome or any kind of tachycardia, we may feel anxious from time to time. Hell yeah, you do, right? Your heart's going out of whack. Like you're gonna worry. That is a body-oriented, a somatogenic neurosis. But in this situation, we talk more of a spiritual neurosis, a mental, emotional, spiritual anxiety, right? The patient experiences this critical phase of her life as an existential crisis, right? So B and I talk about it all the time. When we get to that phase of middle age, the afternoon of life, there's often these existential crises that come with it. She feels threatened because she finds a spiritual deficit when she draws up the balance sheet of her life. How many of us have reached that point in some time of life of recognizing, man, if I look at the balance sheet of my life, if I put my life in an Excel spreadsheet, that would be weird, first of all. But if we put it on a balance sheet and we feel we are lacking, and we recognize, this can be in the morning of life, in young age, right? Like there's the existential anxiety, especially now, telling kids, well, you have to figure out, what you're going to do for the rest of your life by the time you're 18, right? So you can go to college or you go to trade school, wherever it might be, but you have to figure that out. Holy cow, is that anxiety inducing? No, they don't. They just have to figure out what they're going to do today, this week, this month, this year. But this idea of existential crisis in middle life, right? So he goes on to write, the patient in question was a beautiful woman, the darling of society. Now, she had to face up to the new period in her life in which her physical charm would no longer count. She had to be able to bear up in spite of her vanishing beauty. Erotically, this woman was finished. She found herself without aim or purpose in life. I think that's the important thing. She found herself without aim or purpose in life. Whether we're in middle age or the twilight, the dusk, or the morning of life, many of us today, for a variety of reasons, find ourselves without aim or purpose. That's what we talked about this week in the Viktor Frankl Meaning Academy. Purpose. She found herself without aim or purpose in life, without a content for her life, without content. Her existence seemed meaningless to her. She says, I get up in the morning and I ask myself, what is happening today? Nothing is happening today. Naturally, she grew anxious. Right? I was talking about that earlier this week. It may have been in men's group. Right? We all deserve to have, no, it was in the Meaning Academy. We all deserve to have something that motivates us to get out of bed in the morning, right? Sometimes we know there's something calling us, a meaning, but we don't know how to engage it. And it can be tough to get out of bed. But when you find yourself not I don't know, maybe it's just me, but like, if you're not excited to get up and get moving, I told somebody this in the Meeting Academy this week. I said, if you struggle to get up and you don't want to get up and get moving in the morning, get a dog, right? Because, therapy Daisy. Daisy will get me up in the morning. I don't know why it's always me. It's always me. Anytime between 6 and 6:30, Daisy needs to go out. And in all seriousness, that is my first opportunity to transcend myself in the morning, to not sleep in and hit snooze. There is something greater than myself that needs my attention. Greater than myself in the way that if I don't get up and take her out, there will be a stain somewhere on the carpet or the floor. So I might as well go ahead and do it and get on with my day. And then from there, of course, I read, I write, I do things before going into the office that motivate me. As you know, always having something interesting to read, not just getting on the phone and scrolling, right? As we talk about from the anxious generation, you don't want to do that. That's so unhealthy in so many ways. And I know so many people do it, and it breaks my heart. When you go right for that phone and start giving your time to something else in the very first moments of your day, there's something better for you. It was necessary for her to seek content for life, to find the meaning of her life, and thereby to find herself, her inner potentialities. Erotic success and social status no longer counted. She could only reach for moral status. I've got this line highlighted right here. It was necessary to induce this patient to turn away from her anxiety and toward her tasks. Turn away from anxiety and turn toward meaningful, responsible action, tasks, doing something in service of others. When we are focused on others, we don't have time to worry about, oh my goodness, what am I worried about? This positive aim of existential analytical logotherapy, existential analysis, I love that word, can be attained even before the negative goal of psychotherapy in the narrow sense of the word is achieved. In fact, the attainment of the positive aim will, in some circumstances, clear up the neurotic anxiety, since the existential basis of this anxiety will have been withdrawn. As soon as life's fullness of meaning is rediscovered, the neurotic anxiety, to the extent that it is existential anxiety, no longer has anything to fasten on. There is no room for it. And as our patient spontaneously remarked, no time for it. Logotherapy is the answer right there. Logotherapy is the cure to anxiety. You've heard B and I talk about it before. Anxiety can be a motivating factor, again, in the sense that it is a spiritual neurosis and not a physical one. And let's face it, for most of us, it's a neurosis of the spirit. It's a mental, emotional disorder, this anxiety we feel ourselves, this anxiety we put on our kids to enroll a 5 or 6 year old in therapy, or a perfectly healthy 13 or 14-year-old, somebody, right? 13, 14, some of the most difficult times in life, social pressure, peer pressure, hormonal pressure, growth, all these things, school pressure. But you know what? That pressure is good for us. It gives us meaning. It gives us purpose. It gets us up, right? Too often, and I believe this was in one of the stories or podcasts, I couldn't believe it. Kids today are given a free pass in some schools that when they're struggling emotionally, they can get out of class. Well, hell, there are classes I remember. You heard me talk about it last week. Mr. Terpstra's 7th grade honors English class. I don't want to be there. You would have given me a pass to get out of there. I would have been out of there every day. Nobody wanted the fickle finger of fate flying at their face. But I got through it. I was terrified of Mr. Terpstra as a 7th grader, but I respected him. I appreciate him today. It didn't harm me or damage me. It actually gave me some pretty solid core memories about Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, Robert Frost's The Road Not Taken. We have to allow our children, our young adults, to struggle. Dare I say, we need to set up opportunities for them to struggle and fail, because they will fail at some point in life. And if you haven't introduced them to the idea and how to cope with it, they will be handicapped later in life and have no idea how to deal with it. And I think we all know some young adults, some adults right now that can't deal with failure, that can't deal with difficulty. How do you learn to deal with difficulty? You experience difficult times in life. You get through them and you realize you've made it to the other side. So, what is the solution to these childhood anxieties, to this epidemic of mental illness? It's logotherapy. It's meaning, purpose, and resilience. Just this week in Your Search for Meaning, we were talking about Dr. Elise put together a beautiful chapter, a beautiful module on purpose. And then she had to be called away on purpose and couldn't present it. But she literally wrote the book on purpose, a book on purpose, Dr. Elise Cortez. You should check it out. So she shared some of her notes with us, and B and I took the reins and had an amazing group once again. But she talks about this when if we go with the previous story, meaning is that spark we feel that compels us to move forward into life, whatever that might be. Purpose is the actions that we take to fulfill that meaning. And then resilience protects that spark. It protects us through different attitudes and behaviors that help us bounce back in times of difficulty, right? So Elise points this out. When you are living your purpose, you are of service to others. Purpose, true purpose, usually finds a way to be of service. Well, that's right out of Frankl's self-transcendence, right? If we are of living a life of purpose, we are helping others. We are transcending ourselves to do things for others or for a cause greater than ourselves. But with that, we are also experiencing personal growth. If we feel compelled to get out of bed and engage in something meaningful, to take purposeful action throughout our day, we can't help but grow. I shared with you last week some of the decisions I was facing and the opportunities and the decisions, and recognize, God, it was not fun sometimes, but well, I grew with these two books. I got the opportunity to hang out with some great friends and ask some difficult questions. It wasn't fun. Maybe it wasn't truly suffering, but it certainly helped me grow. I felt like I was living a life of purpose. And this was interesting from Elise. If you're living a life in purpose, you're also building community. You're connecting with others. And it only took a few seconds for me to realize, wow, she is exactly right with that. When I feel I am being compelled to discover meaning and live a life of purpose, I'm connecting with others, connecting with those I already know in ever better and greater ways, but then also cultivating community and new friendships. And maybe you can engage in this retroactively, right? Go build a community, seek personal growth, read, listen, right? We live in a time where we get to choose everything that goes into our mind on a minute-by-minute basis. Podcasts, books, right? I was talking to a client, a gentleman in our men's group, and he said, I finally had to give up on the library and just pay Amazon $2.99 to get the videos we were watching. If some of you of a certain age may remember a time where if you wanted a book, you had to go to the library. Or maybe, if like me, you had to go to the mall to, I wish I could remember the name of that bookstore, but it was the only bookstore around, right? You either got it at the library or the bookstore in the mall. And then Barnes and Noble came along. God, that was awesome. I spent so many hours in the psychology shelves of Barnes and Noble. And now Amazon, right? And not just Amazon. You can get a sample of any book you want on your Kindle immediately. There's no reason not to engage in personal growth. If you're not reading, you can be listening. You can be watching YouTube. Rather than watching videos of cute kittens and people ramping their bikes into trees, learn something. Check out the Dr. Dan YouTube channel. There's a lot of other ones out there too that'll help you grow and learn, but we get to choose every minute what goes into our head. Choose wisely. And then I want to end on meaning, purpose. We'll end on resilience, right? By not allowing our children and young adults to struggle and maybe even to suffer and fail, we are not helping them develop resilience. Resilience comes from failing. We can prepare for failure by engaging in habits and behaviors, exercise and pushing ourselves and growing and having a spiritual life. But true resilience comes from small doses of struggling and failing and picking ourselves up and going back on. Abigail Schreier gives a great example throughout her, many great examples throughout her book. She goes back and looks at some history, particularly her grandparents and people of that generation, right? She tells the story of how her grandmother lost her mother in childbirth. Her mom, her great-grandmother, died in childbirth, and her siblings blamed her for the rest of her life. Then she contracted polio and had to live in an iron lung for a year. And then dad had to work a lot of jobs to support 3 kids. So she went out and got a job early. She went to school. All of these things, right? There's a reason that generation, pre-World War II, those born before World War II, those that served in World War II are called the greatest generation because of the struggles they endured. They probably have the greatest sense of resilience of any generation in quite a while. A Spartan level of resilience. And yet, every generation, we wanted to make things a little bit easier, a little bit better. But unfortunately, it's starting to backfire. That is why these books believe, these authors believe, we have a mental illness epidemic. There are things we can do about it. We can encourage our children. We can encourage our young adults to try, to strive, to grow, to do, but then to also fail. Fail while they're still with us in our homes so that we can pick them up, teach them a lesson, and encourage them to get going again. But don't do it for them. One more personal story that just occurred to me. So my oldest daughter a few weeks ago, I think I may have shared bits and pieces of this. I was on my way to visit the youngest daughter, and the oldest one, I was listening to a great audio book. The oldest one called me and says, Dad, I've been in an accident. I said, oh my goodness, are you okay? Is everything all right? Yeah, she's fine. Is the other person okay? Yes, the other person was okay. So, all right. Now, there was a part of me as I was already heading in that direction that could have veered from visiting my one daughter to go save my daughter who had just been in an accident. But she didn't need to be saved. She needed to learn how to deal with police officers and insurance companies, right? Because these things happen in adult life. And at almost 22 years old, it was time to learn how to do it. And she did a great job. And when I got home that evening, my wife said, well, what kind of car are you going to get her? And I said, I'm not. That was a difficult conversation, but 22, you, by accident, totaled the car we had given you that you had driven in high school. It's time to learn how to go buy a car. And we had an amazing time. It was hard. I did not want to drive 2 hours away to go search for a car for or with her. But our exchange back and forth that week or two to get to that point, the growing pains she obviously experienced, the struggle, the anxiety. It's hard doing this. But I tell you what, this was amazing. We got through it. She got it. She was very happy with her new vehicle. It was proud dad moment here. It was about a week later, she called me. She said, Dad, they want me to sign. They said there was some paperwork that they forgot to give me. And in this paperwork, it had indicated there was something that the add-on at the dealership of some security measure or anti-theft measure, whatever it was. They said, well, you have to take this. It's just our policy. We can't take it off. It was about $500. So negotiating the deal at 7:30 at night, I said, okay, whatever. And then they wanted her to sign a paper saying that she had the option to decline that, but she accepted it. And she called me. She said, Dad, I don't agree to that. They didn't give me the option. So, you're right. What are you going to do about it? Right? As a dad, I could have said, send it to me. I'll take care of that right now. But I didn't. I wanted her to try it. I wanted her to make that decision. If you don't agree with something that much, what are you going to do about it? She said, I don't know. Let me think about it. And the next day she said, Dad, I texted the young man that sold us the car. I said, I don't agree with this. I'm not signing the paper. We need to figure something out. And they went back and forth for that entire week. And eventually, I did step in and I said, I'll help you here. I'll contact the finance manager and ask what's going on. And we went back and forth with her in the email. And they said, you know what? That was our mistake. We'll go ahead and refund that money. We'll send you a check. We just need you to sign. We'll change that document to say you declined the anti-theft, and we'll reimburse you that $500. And I told my daughter, I said, wow, good job. Way to stand up for yourself. Way to be resilient. Now, she did admit. She said, Dad, I couldn't have done that without you. I wouldn't have known what to say. And I said, that doesn't matter, right? You got to learn about it, but you also stood up for yourself. And you displayed great resilience and really some great moral character. I was proud of her. These are the things we can do for our children when we challenge them, when we encourage them to challenge themselves. And I hope those of you who listen to this podcast regularly, you've heard these things before. You know these. Hopefully you're doing them. Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes we want to mow down the obstacles in our children's way. Sometimes we want to orchestrate their friendships and their activities and everything they do from the minute they wake up till they go to sleep. Sometimes it's okay for them to be free range, to get out and find some friendships, to walk down the block or even a couple blocks, to go knock on somebody's door and say, hey, can little Billy come out? Can Tommy come out? Can we play? There's some continued health benefits in allowing our children, our young adults, our adults to be autonomous, independent, and responsible human beings. Hey, that was fun. I would encourage you to grab copies of these books. I love Jonathan Haidt's Happiness Hypothesis. I grabbed another copy to read it again. I grabbed the Kindle copy so I can keep it with me. The other copy's in my office if you're ever there. I'm sure you've seen it. We've referred to it. The Anxious Generation, How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. And Abigail Schreier's Bad Therapy, Why Kids Aren't Growing Up. Some great reads. You know what else is great? The Viktor Frankl Meaning Academy's Your Search for Meaning. We have a lot of fun there. Another great convocation of meaning seekers this past Wednesday, focused on Dr. Elise teaching through BNI about the idea of purpose. So join us there. You can find out more at themeaningacademy.com. Once again, I have hinted at 2 new ventures coming up. I can't wait to share with you. So keep listening. Ideally, we'll start talking about these 2 new therapeutic ventures here soon. And you can continue to check danielafranz.com to find out more. That's DANIELAFRANZ.com. And as always, as my sweatshirt today says, be kind. Live your life with meaning, purpose, and resilience. And once again, as always, thank you for this opportunity to bring a little bit of mental health and meaning to your day. Take care.